Mr. Schulte here with a quick look at Cowboys and Indians. Before we get started, let's take a look at some learning objectives, things that we want to be able to identify by the time you're done with this video. First, we're going to compare and contrast Native Americans with white settlers and talk about why white people began to move out west and encroach upon Indian land. Next, we'll take a look at the government and how they tried to restrict Native Americans' movements and really change their way of life. That continues in with our third objective, looking at this policy of assimilation and then open conflicts and wars between the United States government and Native Americans. Then we'll trace the development of the cattle industry, and so cowboys out west. And finally, we'll take a look at the myth and reality between what people often think of American cowboys and what their day-to-day life actually was like. And wrap up with the end of the open range. So to start things off, if I asked you to think of a traditional Native American, I would imagine this is the image you're thinking of, or something pretty close to it. And it's really not that far off, considering we're going to be out in the plains, and many of these Native Americans in the plains are nomadic hunters. As we take a look at Native Americans, notice the date here, 1784. This is 5 years before the Constitution was created, and all of this map in green was land that was controlled by Native Americans. Now, if we fast forward to modern day, you can see that green land has almost completely disappeared, and Native Americans have been shoved into these tiny little pockets within the United States. And so the question is, why did white people move out west, and what happened to the Native Americans? Well, to answer that first question of why people moved out west, you have to think about increased population growth. As more and more people were born or came to America, they had to go somewhere. Often, people moved out west for free farmland, and then adventure, gold, maybe even just a fresh start. And as they moved out west, they encroach upon Indian lands. And so I'm going to ask you to think about here for a moment and jot some ideas down. How would white people moving out west onto this Native American land, how would it change the way Native Americans lived? So take a moment and come up with a couple of ideas on your own. One of the first things we're going to be introduced here is the spread of disease. Now, this wasn't always something that happened on purpose. I mean, naturally, when you meet new people, you're going to then bring your diseases with them. Think about school. So we just finished up our first week here, and right now everyone's happy to be back at school, and it's great. But it's the first week, and where you've been all summer long, and the diseases you have are going to come with you. Wait 2 weeks, and then take a look around your classes and see if you notice people stop coming for a little bit, because those diseases have caught up with them. And that's what's going to happen to Native Americans, having built up resistance to European diseases, and so they're going to wipe that population out. The biggest of these diseases, and one you'll want to know, is smallpox. This one in particular really ravaged the Native American population. Next up, we have the destruction of the buffalo. And this was often done on purpose, as the saying was, a dead buffalo is a dead Indian, because the buffaloes meant so much to the Native Americans. Now, if you take a look at this picture on the right and look very closely, you'll see that's 40,000 buffalo hides. 40,000. Now, at the beginning of American society, estimates say there's 20 to 30 million buffalo roaming North America. And by the time we get to the 1900s, roughly 1,000 were left. So think about that, 30 million to 1,000 buffalo. And I've seen some reports to go as low as 26 buffalo existed in North America as we finished the century there. And so why was the buffalo so important to the Native Americans? I like to refer to it as the Indians' Walmart. If you take a look at this image, anything that the Plains Indians needed, the buffalo then provided them, from food to housing, clothing, toys, and even ceremonial items as well. And so the destruction of the buffalo takes away not only a food source, but just a major resource in general for Native Americans. The next thing that's going to happen as white people move out west is they're going to take Native American land. Native Americans had this communal ownership of land, and nobody really owned this set of land. Between this tree and that tree is mine. That wasn't how it works out. That's more of a European society. And think of today, how many of you have fences in your backyard, or you have private property signs up on your land to keep other people out. That wasn't something that Native Americans, so that's not something that they did. And so white people with our very defined population, or with our very defined property ownership, we're going to shove this onto the Indians as well. And so we do that with the Dawes Act. Native Americans living communally, what's going to happen is the government's going to take that land and redistribute it to the Native Americans in 160-acre plots. What this does is it takes hundreds of thousands of acres and it squeezes it down to maybe 10,000 acres, and we give it to the Native Americans. And the rest of that land is then going to be sold off for cheap. And we're talking hundreds of thousands of acres taken from Native Americans and sold to white people so they could then move out west. We're restricting the movement of Native Americans. The next policy that our government adopts is the policy of assimilation. Now, this is a key term, and we'll see this throughout the year, so you'll definitely want to make sure you're getting this one down and you understand it. The definition of assimilation, as you can see, is to take on customs and beliefs of another culture. The government is going to force Native Americans to become white, to get rid of the beliefs, the culture, the customs that they're used to, and adopt that of the dominant white culture. Now, in this picture, we can see that comes off in a very obvious way. This little Indian boy, his hair was cut, and his clothes are going to be changed. But it's also going to continue on by taking Native American children away from their parents, sending them to these American boarding schools, teaching them English, forcing Christianity upon them, and also even changing their names. And in doing so, they hope to get the savage out of them and make them more civilized and live in a white society. So we're changing their hair, their clothes, their language, their religion, and then if we tie in the Dawes Act, we're also changing the way that they lived. No longer are they nomadic, but now they have permanent settlements on these 160-acre plots of land. And naturally, conflict is going to arise between those Native Americans that resisted and the American government. And so one conflict that we're going to take a look at in particular in class is the Sand Creek Massacre. And this is one that historians have in recent years really begun to look at, that something was really up at this Sand Creek Massacre. And so this is something we'll dive a little deeper into class, as it seems like maybe it wasn't as clear-cut as it once was thought. All right, other conflicts are going to be over material items as well. And so gold will be discovered out west in the Black Hills, and so that'll be another reason for the American government to tell these people that we've already moved and forced into land that now you need to move again because you have something of value of ours. Major conflicts that you may have heard of before would be Little Bighorn, or also known as Custer's Last Stand. But the one you want to know for the test will be Wounded Knee. And why this is important is the date here and what it signifies. By the end of the 1800s, Native Americans no longer resisted white expansion. This was the last battle that the Native Americans had against the American government, and after that they were reserved to live on the reservations and live a pretty subdued life. Switching topics here, we're going to then jump into cowboys. And so I want you to take a moment or two and think about TV, movies, books, conversations, things you know about cowboys, and jot down, what do you know about cowboys and their way of life? What do they wear? What do they say? What do they do? Those types of things. So take a moment and jot some of those things down. I would imagine many of you are going to, in your mind, create a picture of a cowboy that looks like this. And that's not wrong. It's just not 100% accurate. It would be wrong to not include cowboys like this in your mental image of cowboys. On the left, we have African Americans, which made up 25% of the cowboy population. And on the right, we have some Hispanic cowboys, or vaqueros, coming from Mexico and living in that southern region. And that was about 15%. So you're talking about 40% of the cowboy population is going to be a minority, which is interesting if you think about the time period that cowboys existed. We're talking about 1850s, 1860s, and into the 1870s. This is a time in American history where race is a pretty big deal. Same time as the Civil War is going on. But what's interesting is these people were treated as equals in the West. And I think that speaks a lot to what the cowboy had to do. This is a job where skill mattered more than skin color. If you could ride and you could rope, People wanted to hire you. And so let's take a look at what these cowboys are doing. As we said, it's big business, a great opportunity for these cattle ranchers to make a lot of money. If we're in the 1860s, what major event is happening in America? The Civil War, of course, right? And so while people are engaged in fighting and trying to unify the Union, they're not producing. There's not enough food to go around for everyone. And so the cattle ranchers in the West, and in particular down in Texas, take advantage of this opportunity. As technology increases and we have railroads reaching out west, these cattle ranchers, all they need to do is get their cows from the south to the north, and they can ship them all the way over to, as you can see, Chicago, where the meatpacking industry is going to be. And then they can feed the people of the East and make a lot of money in a very short period of time. So starting in the southern part of Texas, if you look at the map here, you'll see the Chisholm Trail. That's the green trail on the right. This is the most popular of cattle trails. And it started out, it was like 200 some miles, and then by the time it was done, it ended up being 800 miles. So 800 miles, you're taking these cows from the south to the north. And let's take a look at these cows. If you're a Texas University fan, you'll know that they are the Texas Longhorns, named after the longhorn here, as the longhorn is a special breed of cow. As ranchers took these cows from the south to the north to these northern railroad lines and then shipped them to the east, they needed an animal that could, A, walk the 800 miles the trail was going to be, and not lose a whole lot of weight, as they get paid per pound. And so the longhorn is definitely going to be that animal. And we see Texas University, like many other universities, will take part of their state's history or culture and then use that as a mascot here. Now the end of ranching came about pretty quickly, and you can see the reasons on the screen in front of you. Bad weather, we're going to have a couple of harsh back-to-back years of blizzards, and then really dry and hot summers. Cows needed to eat as they walked, and so as the weather didn't cooperate, the grass didn't grow as thick, and then as more and more people tried to jump on this idea of making money by shipping cows out east, they ate their food source. You gotta eat and drink on your 800 miles all the way up, and if your herds get too big or there are too many herds, you're going to eat the grass before it has a chance to grow back, and your cows are going to die. And then on top of that, as we talked about people moving out west, more and more people are going to be moving out west in the middle of the 1800s, and we already talked about white people having very particular defined property rights, and so they didn't like these ranchers and their cows going through their property, and so they began to put up barbed wire fences saying, this is my land, stay out. And so these three reasons, bad weather, overgrazing, and barbed wires, or people moving out west, are really what's going to bring an end to the cattle industry. Now, it's kind of like a flash in the pan. It was here and then it was gone, but the legacy of it is going to live on. These are probably some names that you're familiar with, you've heard of before. And so these Wild West shows are going to exist. We're going to keep the Wild West alive and bring it to the East Coast. And it will fascinate people for decades. And even into the early 1900s, we'll see a lot of dime novels or little short stories are going to be Western themed that kids are going to enjoy, and then they can pretend to be cowboys and chasing down, bandits or Indians as far as that goes. And so that's going to wrap up our first little screencast here. I hope you enjoyed it.